Hi, Smarter News. There are all sorts of references to red lines in this news cycle, and I want to focus on two of them today as we watch the headlines roll in. We have a big news day. We have the meeting of the G7 today, and we're 1 week away from the deadline from the full withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. So, taking that into consideration, it's early. There's a lot of ways that the news can develop, but because we're hearing these references to red lines, I thought, well, what can we look at that are two diametrically opposed references that give us an idea into kind of this situation that we're all witnessing in Afghanistan? One of the things that we talked a little bit about yesterday on Instagram stories was a reference to the Taliban spokesman. And I want to show you who the Taliban spokesman is, because this is where we're getting some of our information. He actually has a very active Twitter account, just under 400,000 followers. So if you want to follow along with what the Taliban is saying officially from their spokesperson, he is on Twitter in English and otherwise. He's giving interviews, and this is where some of the references I'm going to be talking about are coming from. Here's what he last put out on Twitter just yesterday to give you an idea of the sort of public relations that the Taliban is trying to do in Afghanistan. This is a short video. It's about 20 seconds long, of girls going back to school in quote unquote a new Afghanistan. This has been an issue of contention about whether or not the Taliban would allow little girls to go to school and what those schools would look like. So this is the video that the spokesperson has chosen to put out. In the meantime, there was an interview that he just did yesterday with Sky News, where the reporter asked him point blank, what do you think about the United States staying past the August 31st deadline? And he said this is a red line for the Taliban, that the United States are occupiers, more or less invaded the country, and that's a red line for the Taliban, that they should leave by August 31st. That's part of an agreement. So that is the red line reference from the Taliban that I just want you to make note of. When he was asked about some accusations of atrocities that have happened at the hands of the Taliban over the last several weeks, he called those reports fake news. So see how the Taliban is using the language that we're all very familiar with to also talk about their own story and also use social media. Remember, the Taliban years ago, there was no internet, there was no open communication in the country. So now that you're seeing the Taliban embrace social media and use it in this way is also very interesting and notable, and it's part of the story. So let's take the flip side of another red line. The Human Rights Commission came out just today with an address or a report, and I put that full report on our website so you can look at it as well. What the report was talking about was credible reports from inside Afghanistan of some of executions, restrictions on women, restrictions on the right to move, the restrictions on the right to go to school. And the Human Rights Commission said this is a fundamental red line for the United Nations, that the treatment of women is a fundamental red line that they're watching as far as any human rights atrocities that are happening inside of Afghanistan. But this report is fairly thorough with some different angles of the story, including how the displacement of people inside Afghanistan is also pressuring the countries surrounding the region. So again, looking at this as not just a truly Afghanistan story, but one that has a lot of ripple effects. So red lines, right? What are red lines? And with these references from the United Nations and even the Taliban, again, two opposing groups, what are we to make of them? Well, the United States has also been asked about their red lines as well. And one of the things to just note about red lines is, well, what happens when someone crosses a red line? The Taliban can say that it's a red line that the United States should not cross by staying inside the country. But then what happens if the United States does? Same with the United Nations. They can say that it's a red line about the Taliban's treatment of women. But what happens if the Taliban doesn't allow girls to go to school? Then what, right? It's the then what to the red line that's really the question. And one of the things that's really at the heart of a lot of these news stories when we're looking at the stakes is the tension between capability and will, right? The United States has the capability to stay inside Afghanistan if they want to, right? If we want to stay in Afghanistan, we have the capability, we have the military power to do so. The question is whether or not we have the will. The United Nations can say that they're going to continue monitoring the situation, They may have the capability to do that inside Afghanistan, but do they have the will? And what is the will of the United Nations or the global community to enforce any sort of punishment if the Taliban decide to cross this red line? So it's really a tension of capability and will. What's interesting this morning is we're waking up to a lot of reports that the Biden administration will decide within the next 24 hours. So maybe by the time you see this report, about whether or not they will extend the deadline past August 31st. And perhaps that there's some conversations that are taking place behind closed doors between the U.S. government and the Taliban. So we'll see if there's any developments to that. Regardless of a change of timeline, though, that question of red lines and what happens if a red line is crossed is one that is without a lot of specifics right now. And really that question of capability and will. So I want you just to think a little bit about that. Let me just talk about a red line related to the pandemic in a little bit of a different way. I just want to briefly touch on this because something you might be seeing regarding COVID-19 is, again, references to the sort of this surge of the Delta variant sort of peaking in America. And I want to show you this new map that I'm looking at that's being referenced a lot, developed by those at Ivy League universities. And what this map is looking at in America is something that is a measurement of basically transmissibility of the virus, or for every one infection, how many more infections can it cause? And so this is what the map looks like today. And what you should note by this is there's somewhat of a red line when it comes to COVID-19 too, which is that if you're seeing this measurement, this something called the R naught below 1, then you're at a point where that maybe the surge of infection is peaking, that the epidemic is contracting rather than expanding. And that's apparently what this map is showing, that the R naught is about 1 or lower. And so you're seeing a lot of beige and gray in the country versus seeing something that looked a little bit more like this just about 4 weeks ago, where again, the amount of infections that were being caused by a single infection was much higher. So that's why you're getting some of these reports that maybe in the South that the wave that this surge was causing has now peaked. The only important thing to remember about that is when a wave crashes, right, when it peaks and crashes, you still have to have the wave come down. And that's when we really watch, is continuing to watch hospitalizations and deaths, because what we really want to know about what's happening with this surge is, yes, we know the infection from the Delta variant is a lot more. The question is it causing more severe illness? When you look at the percentages, right, you can have a lot of infection, a lot of people in the hospital, but percentage-wise, is that much higher than the previous cycles that we've seen as well? So I just want you to be aware of that. I have a lot of questions for the FDA about their approval for the Pfizer vaccine, or what it's known as Comirnaty. Say that a couple times fast. The name of the vaccine with FDA approval now is that name, and it's supposedly a combination of COVID, mRNA vaccine, and community and immunity all mixed together. Very interesting article about the brand team that put together that vaccine name. Just so that we're clear, I'll continue to call it the Pfizer vaccine just for ease, okay? But I do have some questions for the FDA, because I know one of the questions that you have is, hey, a lot of clinical trials are still ongoing, so how do you get full outright approval when we haven't even seen this vaccine with emergency use authorization for a year? It's a great question. So let's get a little more context, and that's something I'm going to be asking them about. All right, so a lot of developing stories, a lot of things to watch. I'm thinking about red lines. You know, last week we talked a little bit about my husband, former Navy SEAL, wrote a book with his partner, Jocko Willink, called Extreme Ownership, How Navy SEALs Lead and Win. And one of their tenets is, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. It's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. So it's not what you preach, the red line, it's what you tolerate. It's the behavior after it. So just some things to think about today. Keep your questions and comments coming. All of this and more on smarternews.com, and I always look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you soon.